Okay, so we're going to start chapter 4. This is going to include fundamental research issues and aspects of research. And so we'll start with validity. Okay, we usually have validity and reliability when we talk about overall research, methods used in research, measurements used in research. So when it comes to, okay, so reliability is basically how able are we to reproduce the same results over and over with a measurement, whereas with validity, we're looking at the extent to which conclusion is reasonably accurate or true. Does the research or the measure we're using or assessment we're using represent what we're truly wanting to study? So, for example, if I'm using a thermometer to measure the temperature, does that thermometer accurately measure the temperature? Now, if it is calibrated correctly and working correctly, it does. That would be a valid measure or measurement. However, if it's not calibrated correctly, it may reliably uh, produce the same results over time, but they're not going to be accurate or accurately reflect what the actual temperature is. So it would be reliable, but it wouldn't be valid. So when we're talking about validity, there has to be an accurate representation of whatever we're measuring, is what validity is. So there's four different types. We have construct, internal, external, and statistical validity. Uh, Construct validity, and there's varying levels of this within research, especially within measurements within research. So within construct validity, the measurement that we're using, okay, let's say we're using an assessment, it accurately represents the variable being studied. So in regard to, let's say, depression, let's say we're using an assessment to measure depression. Um, we need to make sure that that assessment accurately reflects the symptoms of depression. If it does, that would be a valid measure. If we're only measuring, let's say, lethargy, all right, we're just measuring how lethargic somebody is. That isn't going to fully represent the construct of depression, so it would not have construct validity. Also, internal validity. So, how accurate are the conclusions drawn about that are related to cause and effect? So, can we say that one variable is indeed causing another variable to covary? External validity, on the other hand, is when findings can accurately be generalized to other populations and settings. So this has to do almost external to the research, you could say, in that whatever findings we find with the participants we have, can we generalize that to other populations? So let's say that, all right, we are conducting a widespread study on Americans. And we're able to properly represent Americans demographically across a wide array of participants. We would probably be able to say, yes, we have a sample of participants, but we would probably be able to generalize that to Americans. Let's say, though, that we're trying to study how, we're conducting a study on Americans, but we only have a sample of people from Nebraska. Now, in regard to that, that's going to have a lower level of external validity because you probably, because of those demographic limitations, you're probably not going to be able to generalize your findings beyond Nebraska because that is what your sample represents. So you need to have a representative sample in order to generalize your findings to that wider population. And then there's also statistical validity, is how accurate are the statistical conclusions that we get from the investigation. And so that's going to have to do with the statistical analyses and tests that we run. Okay, so we have validity, then we have variables. All right, a variable is something that changes. All right, so a variable literally varies. Anything that varies and can be measured is a variable. So again, we can talk about like depression. Depression can be a variable. It's something that can increase or decrease, and it's something that we can measure based upon the symptomatology in the DSM. So it both varies, goes up and down, and we can measure it. So, yep, it could be a behavior, it could be thoughts, it could be feelings, it could be situations, characteristics, or events. So anything that we can objectively measure is a variable. And it has to have at least two or more levels or values. So for some variables, the values will have true numeric or quantitative properties. So it might be different levels, so 0 to 10 in regard to depressive related symptoms, or it can be present or not present. And so the values of other variables may not be numeric, but instead simply identify different categories. So that would be, again, like gender, eye color, blue or brown or green. There's no 0 to 10 ranking necessarily. It is a static, uh, basically descriptive word instead of a numeric value. So we have all different types of variables, but again, it varies. Anything that can vary and be measured. Now, here's the next step. So we might determine different variables we want to study. So again, maybe we want to study depression levels in students at North Platte Community College. Okay, so depression, that's a variable. And when we talk about this variable that we want to study and measure, what we need to do is define, what does that variable mean? What is depression? That's where we develop these operational definitions. So in order to study it, we have to be able to define it, because depression might be defined in different ways depending upon what you want to, how you want to conceptualize it. I would probably use the DSM-5 text revision. Somebody else might use the ICD-10, which may vary a little bit. Somebody else might use a totally different conceptualization of depression. So it's important to operationalize these variables so we can actually conceptualize them in concrete terms and then measure them. If we don't do that, this is just an abstract concept that's floating around if there's no definition for it. Okay, operational definitions and construct validity. Okay. The validity is going to refer to the accuracy of our operational definition. So does the definition of a variable actually reflect the true theoretical meaning of the variable? So if I were to use the characteristics and symptomatology of depression from the DSM-5 text revision, theoretically, based upon the theories underlying the development of the DSM, that would accurately reflect depression. So we would be able to say, yes, there is high construct validity of the definition that I have of depression. If I were instead going to define depression as levels of sadness, and that's it, that's going to have fairly low construct validity because there really aren't any theoretical models that are going to uphold that definition or operationalization of depression. So that's going to have very low construct validity. Okay, so when we talk about variables, the four most common relationships found between variables that have values along a numeric scale are positive linear relationship. So as one variable increases, so does another. There's a negative linear relationship. As one increases, the other decreases. And then we have a curvilinear relationship, as in that changes in the first variable are accompanied by systematic increases or decreases in another relationship, or there's just no relationship at all. And I think these are pretty much straightforward, but just in case, here's the positive. Okay, if we're looking at, oh boy, there's all different examples here. So attitude change and speech rate. As speech rate increases, so does attitude change. Attitude change increases as speech does. That's a positive linear relationship. A negative one, so as the amount of noise decreases, group size increases. All right, so curvilinear, linear. All right, so the liking for stimulants as it and the complexity of visual stimulus, again, as there's going to be basically a sweet spot right here, in that the liking for stimuli, again, I'm going to be right about here. And then as the liking for the stimulus, or as the complexity of visual stimulus increases, the liking decreases. So again, there's kind of that sweet spot. And then no relationship, yeah, it does nothing. Okay, so these four relationships, they're general patterns. Individual deviations are likely, so you're probably going to have outliers, but in general, based upon statistical analyses, you are going to have some sort of relationship And there is, again, a numerical index of strength of the relationship between variables, and this is going to be your correlation coefficient. You do not need to worry about this right now. We'll deal with it when we statistically analyze your data, but just to give you a basic overview of this. And then also in relationships and reduction of uncertainty, we're going to be able to reduce uncertainty or random variability by increasing our understanding of the variables. So we work to identify systematic relationships between variables. So literally like, okay, is age related to Instagram use? Again, so this is why we conduct this research to determine, okay, are there relationships between these? And it's just not random in that it's a random or spontaneous relationship that has no real relationship. Okay, so regard to Instagram user. Okay, so 60% between 18 and 49 say yes, and 40% say no. This is out of 100 participants. People 50 and over, 21% say yes, 79% say no. So again, this is how we start to develop basic knowledge about the relationship between variables, and then obviously we can get much more complex as we develop this knowledge. All right, so in this class, we're going to use the non-experimental method in order to conduct our research, but we have non-experimental and experimental. We're going to go over experimental as much as possible in some of the lighter weeks, I should say. But anyways, the non-experimental method. This is when relationships are studied by observing variables of interest. Okay. We are not manipulating any of the variables. We are just literally observing them varying in the natural world. And a relationship is established when two of the variables vary together. As we said, do they increase together? Does one increase while one decreases? Is there a curvilinear relationship, or is there no relationship at all? So there's no manipulation of variables, whereas in the experimental method, the researcher is going to manipulate the independent variable and control all of the other variables, either by randomization or direct experimental control. So there's going to be much more control in an experiment. There's going to be less impact of confounding variables as well. But as the researcher manipulates the independent variable, they're going to predict that the dependent variable will also vary. So the two variables, again, they don't merely vary together. One is introduced first to determine whether it affects the second. So this would be like again, if we're on the same page as the depression page. So this would be like a clinical trial with a new depression medication. So you have individuals with depression. One group is going to receive a placebo, and what they're expecting is that there is no difference in depression levels in those individuals, whereas they give the other group, again, through randomization and possibly a double blind, and participants obviously do not know what group they're in. The other group gets the depression medication, and what they're expecting is those people's depression levels will decrease. So by the introduction of that depression medication, which is going to be the independent variable, that is going to influence the dependent variable, which are depression levels. Okay, so non-experimental method, what we are doing, because again, conducting an experiment is a little bit beyond the scope of this course. But the non-experimental method, again, it's the correlational method. We're trying to determine, is there a correlation or relationship between variables? And it's not ideal when we ask questions about cause and effect. We are not going to be able to prove cause and effect in using the non-experimental method. Also, it can be difficult to tell the direction of the cause and effect. So which variable is actually affecting the other? Does the chicken come before the egg? Also, there's the third variable problem, or confounding variables, in the possibility that there is additional variables out there that exist in influencing the relationship between our variables that we're not taking into account. And when we know that an uncontrolled third variable is operating, we can call the third variable a confounding variable. So if we know there's another variable outside of whatever we are studying that could be affecting it, then we can say it's a confounding variable. And it's hard, especially in non-experimental research, in order to account for all of the potential confounding variables that could be influencing the relationship. Thus, we cannot say that one variable causes the effect in another because there's always probably going to be something else that's influencing it. Okay, so we have the directionality problem. Okay, exercise causes anxiety reduction. So exercise results in anxiety reduction. Or does anxiety cause a reduction in exercise? Which way are we looking? Or again, which way does this work? Also, the third variable problem, higher income leads to both lower anxiety and more exercise. Okay. However, again, what else might be at play here? Okay. Higher income doesn't, maybe there's something else in there that also influences increased levels of exercise and lower levels of anxiety. Maybe it's the impact of accessibility to healthcare. Maybe it is accessibility to or being able to pay one's bills. Maybe it is maybe there's probably something else involved here and beyond higher income or associated with it. Okay. All right. So with the experimental method, we're still doing good. The experimental method is going to reduce ambiguity and uncertainty in interpreting the results, unlike the non-experimental method. So the manipulated variable is going to be called the independent variable. Again, so in regard to my depression example, this would be the antidepressant. That is our independent variable. The variable that is measured is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is going to depend upon the presence of that independent variable. So the dependent variable is going to literally vary based upon the presence of that antidepressant. So experimental procedures ensure that any differences between groups are due to that manipulated variable. There's enough control that they can make sure that the changes in depression levels are due to the introduction of that depression medication. So experimenters are able to control extraneous variables. They make sure every feature of the environment except the manipulated variable is held constant, that nothing else is changing, that, somebody isn't necessarily winning the lottery or somebody's not going through a divorce. Those type of things would be third variables that could affect the influence of that independent variable on the dependent variable. Also, randomization enhances this as well, in that any variable that cannot be held constant, it's controlled by making sure that the effects of the variable are random. And so you do not know whether you're going to be in the experimental or the control group. That randomization in and of itself kind of controls for any of those extraneous influences. All right, so when it comes to internal validity and the experimental method, this is our ability to draw conclusions about causal relationships from the results of the study. This is going to be very, very high in experimental research. It's going to be low in non-experimental research. There's a trade-off here. So there's strong internal validity that it requires all of the following. So temporal precedence, again, so that antidepressant comes before the decline in depressive-related symptoms. So we make sure that this comes before that, cause and effect. Also, the covariation of cause and effect, in that as the antidepressant, the presence of it increases, the levels of depression decrease. So you have that covariation. Those two variables are covarying together. And you eliminate plausible alternative explanations through things like randomization and experimental control. That's going to result in high levels of internal validity. And when we study these variables, researchers generally conceptualize them as having a cause and effect relationship within experiments. The variable considered to be the cause is that independent one. Again, that's our depression med. And the variable that is the effect is the dependent variable, the one that is going to vary based upon the presence of that depression medication or the independent variable. A researcher manipulates the independent variable and measures the change in the dependent. So again, the presence or the introduction of that depression medication, they're looking to see how it affects that dependent variable or the levels of depression in participants. So some additional characteristics. Now, here's the thing, is experiments are not going to um, represent or be very generalizable to the general population because experiments are very tightly controlled. And so it's not very realistic. And so when we talk about external validity, again, external validity is how generalizable or applicable are the results of this study to the population beyond our participants. And when it comes to experiments, external validity is pretty low. So as we're going to talk about here, internal validity within experiments is very high. External validity is low. Whereas with non-experimental method, which we're going to use, external validity is high, internal validity is low. So there's a trade-off here. And so the artificial environment that an experiment is going to be conducted in, it is going to limit the external validity of that generalizability beyond the participants. So again, field experiments are going to have the highest level of external validity because you're literally observing people in their natural habitat. And that is going to be generalizable to a wider array of people and the population than, again, those in that experimental realm. So additionally, just trying not to I'm trying not to drag these lectures on too long. I'm trying to give you little bites instead of hours on end. So additional considerations with experimental methods. Some variables cannot or should not be manipulated. Sometimes experimentation would be either unethical or impractical. So participant variables are characteristics of individuals that cannot be manipulated, such as age. Again, you cannot manipulate that. You cannot change that. Another example would be like, again, with the independent variable, we're trying to determine like, okay, what's the effect of like removing somebody's liver on their depression levels? Like we can't remove people's liver to determine, oh, does this increase or decrease people's depression levels? That's unethical and torturous, obviously. So that's a pretty extreme example of that. But again, some variables cannot, age should not, removing liver, be manipulated. But here's the thing. Some questions are not answered by an experiment. Research with the goal of describing behaviors falls into this category. Behaviors are going to be much better explained by the non-experimental research. And successful predictions of future behaviors can often be made without studying cause and effect. That's why we can use the non-experimental method in order to create theories in predicting people's future behavior. And using multiple methods of studying a phenomenon, so if we use both experimental and non-experimental, it's going to yield a better understanding of it. So sometimes this happens in that we will conduct maybe non-experimental research on a certain type of behavior, and we can come up with some conclusions from that research. And the experimental world may take that and conduct experiments similar to what was studied non-experimentally in a lab. And we can do that vice versa. So they really, again, they're going to increase the validity of the overall conclusions from one another's research. All right, so again, validity is the conclusion we're coming to accurate? Is it true and is it accurate? And we have construct, internal, external, and, well, conclusive or statistical conclusion validity as well. So with that being said, again, please that's a lot of information. Please let me know if you have any questions. Check out the resources on Canvas. Otherwise, I hope everybody has an absolutely wonderful day.